public investment that was promised by rich nations many years ago to then encourage the private support. So it's an opportunity for fossil fuel.
Power plant, and that was built in the 1980s. Power. North Africa has some of the highest levels of solar radiation in the world, along with large stretches of undeveloped land. 2025 saw capacity across the continent expand by a record 4.5 gigawatts. A number of African states are pursuing nuclear power, including Egypt, Kenya and Ghana. But to date, South Africa is the only country with a nuclear power plant, and that was built in the 1980s. Let's dive deeper into this. Joining us from Paramaribo in Suriname is NJ Ayuk. He's the executive chairman of the Africa Energy Chamber. In Bangkok, we have Peter Kiernan. He's an independent energy transition analyst focusing on Asia. And in London, Patrick Galley. He is the head of investigations at Global Witness, who leads energy and fossil fuel cases. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Well, to you first of all, Patrick, just how are things? What is the situation now?
Thanks, Richard. I would say the recent violence and price volatility we're seeing is a reminder of how important it is for the world to get its energy transition correct, not just in terms of the long-term health of people and the planet, but also in the name of peace and stability and affordability. No one anywhere, I don't believe, wants their energy bills or food costs to be at the mercy of geopolitics or invasions. And renewables are already cheaper than fossil fuels in more than 90% of projects commissioned. They are more efficient by energy return on investment. They are more popular. And so I would encourage governments to view this crisis as an opportunity to learn the right lessons from our global energy supply, which we are seeing yet again. As long as we remain heavily reliant on imported fossil fuels, our economic well-being will always be, to a certain extent, starved. There will be an asterisk to it. It will always be hitched to events that are quite often outside of our control. And I would say that the renewable transition is something that's happening at scale around the world due to economics, due to scalability, due to cost, but it's something that really needs further support from leaders and policymakers, and it needs further public investment that was promised by rich nations many years ago to then encourage the private support. So it's an opportunity, of course, but it does depend on what lessons policymakers take from it.
Well, indeed, many versions of Chinese don't include the word crisis. They use the word opportunity. So certainly that is one thing. NJ, with the same question in mind, but with specifically more on Africa.
I think we find ourselves in Africa in a war that we didn't start, we didn't create. It's not our war, but we've seen the effects. Long lines in petroleum gas stations in Nairobi or even in Kampala, but also some countries that rely a lot, maybe about 80–90% of their power generation is coming out of oil or natural gas. They're starting to see load shedding. Take, for example, South Sudan. But also, I have to disagree with Patrick on this. This is not a war created by fossil fuels or oil and gas. I think Patrick should get his facts right. The other thing you have to really pay attention to this is that whether you want to transition to renewables, which we don't disagree with, we just believe that, in a sense, Africa has its right to use its resources to get its people out of energy poverty. 600 million Africans today don't have access to electricity. 1 billion no access to clean cooking. This war is creating a problem, but the answer is not to go on a fast-track transition that does not really take into consideration our people and industrialization. Right now, we're seeing austerity with African government because of this crisis. We also seen a lot of countries have to figure out if they have to subsidize petroleum products or if they have to get it from the straight from other sources. It is indeed a dire situation what we face in Africa.
I'm sure Patrick will address some of that later on, but certainly, Peter, of course, perhaps Asia is the most exposed in many ways. The countries like China have to import 80% plus of their energy needs. So what is the situation like that? And do they have more wiggle room to pivot towards renewables?
Yes, I think with the Asian region and Southeast Asia in particular, you could say that this region is acutely exposed to the current crisis in the Persian Gulf. That is because of not just its high level of dependence on fossil fuel imports, namely oil and gas, but also on the share of that does come from the Persian Gulf region. So this does represent something of a crisis for many of these fast-growing large economies, given that high rate of dependence on imports. Very few countries in the region are self-sufficient or net exporters of, say, oil and gas. So there is a high level of import dependence from the Middle East. So this is why this crisis has been acutely felt, not just in terms of price, but eventually in terms of security of supply. I would agree, I guess, that when there's a crisis, there is also an opportunity. The opportunity is for many of these economies to accelerate the energy transition that they have been undergoing already. This can be justified not just in terms of energy security grounds and also for tackling climate change, which also presents security problems itself, but also in terms of economic security. So while there might be some short-term fixes, such as some countries are deciding to ramp up coal-fired power output, in the longer term, there needs to be a look at the balance in terms of the energy mix of plenty of these countries. And with the cheapening technologies of renewables, batteries, and also use of EVs, these things need to be looked at in terms of more durable solutions for the longer term.
Patrick, your environmental credentials are, of course, they're evidenced by the cycle behind you. Now, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission chief, said that turning away from nuclear was a strategic error. Was it?
If you look at France, where I lived for many years, they derive much of their electricity from nuclear. Now, that it obviously comes with its own problems in terms of environmental concerns, but it is lower carbon than more traditional fossil fuels. Nuclear is quite expensive, I will say. In the country where I am now, the UK, we are spending billions on foreign contracts to renew to some extent, but also expand our nuclear fleet. And that is a cost tail that runs into the decades. Nuclear reactors, okay, there's some talk about small nuclear reactors, although they're really only in the design phase still. Nuclear reactors tend to need to be enormous to justify the cost investment. That sort of incentivizes governments to keep them online over a multi-decadal period. And, you know, whilst I'm not necessarily constitutionally against using all the weapons we have in the fight against climate change, I'm not convinced that nuclear is the single greatest option. I would say where we are currently in 2026, we need to think about this from a perspective of the just transition in our energy systems. We need to think about what's best economically, what's best for the climate, of course, but also we need to approach it with equity and fairness and recognise varying historical responsibilities and current capacity to respond. And cost-wise, if we're looking about scaling up energy sources to try and do many things, mitigate climate change, to ease the burden on people's wallets, to improve energy resilience to external shocks, and to help stabilise domestic prices, cost-wise, renewables make a lot more sense than nuclear.
NJ, the thing is, there's 5 African countries which have nuclear programs. Only one has actually built a reactor, and that's, of course, South Africa, as we mentioned earlier. So for many, it's just simply not an option. But what kind of energy shortfall is it that really at the moment has to be addressed? And is there spare capacity to actually meet that demand and supply shortfall?
Absolutely. If there is
Explore Sunday hotels on the OYO website. Discover Sunday stays in London, Staines, Warwickshire, and across 18 cities in the UK. Enjoy a spa, indoor swimming pool, and restaurant bar. Get an extra 10% off exclusively on the OYO website.
This phone is new. This one is verified refurbished by Backmarket. It can do everything a brand new smartphone can. The only difference? It's up to 50% less than brand new. It comes with a 12-month minimum warranty and free 30-day returns. Downgrade now. Backmarket.
Option. I think if you have safe nuclear use, that is very good. We've seen in Europe countries that have abandoned nuclear decommission plant are buying electricity from France that kept nuclear. So what we don't want is to make the mistake the Europeans are making. And the other part you're looking at is that even with gas, the UK is decommissioning gas fields in the North Sea. But guess what? Norway is the drill baby drill capital of Europe, and nobody's complaining about that because they're producing that. We have to first pay attention to energy security, and nuclear energy offers that energy security that Africa needs, and it's going to expand. It's very expensive. Let's not kid about it. But you're going to have SMR, small modular reactors that is going to go in countries like Ghana, like Kenya, and even in Egypt. Base load is key for Africa, not just having wind turbines and solar panels. We want energy for industrialization, so our kids don't have to cross the Mediterranean to look for jobs on European streets.
Patrick, now what is this all likely to do to the carbon trading market and also, plans for net zero?
Plans for net zero are already being scaled back, either on an institutional basis, as you see with some of the big producers, or on a country basis, as you see with the United States. Emissions have increased every year since the Paris Agreement in 2015, apart from when we had a global pandemic. This, to me, suggests that the route that governments are taking to interpret the concept of net zero is dangerously misguided. Net zero really is only as effective to the climate as the size of the net. And what you see is a lot of mature economies who are historically responsible for the vast vast majority of historical emissions, i.e. they contributed most to the problem, are the ones who are advocating for the largest possible net. That is, we continue as business as usual for many, many years, and then at some point in the 2040s, we scale out technology that is still really only locally available, such as carbon capture, such as land-based solutions, to try and suck all of this carbon back in and mitigate it. The problem, of course, with that is that climate change is as much a stock problem as it is a flow. By that I mean, even if we stopped emitting greenhouse gases, and I'll remind viewers that greenhouse gases are increasing every year, even if we stopped producing them tomorrow, the carbon still sits in the atmosphere. So the impact of this crisis, I would hope that historic rich emitters such as the EU stop and think, how much longer are we going to put up with a system of importing fossil fuels at large cost? And remember, the EU spent billions, hundreds of billions of dollars post-Ukraine to reroute its energy supplies from Russia. At what point are we actually going to take responsibility for our contribution to the crisis, the UK included, and the US especially? And sit down and say, well, no, not just from an economic perspective in terms of price shocks, in terms of sustainable development and trying to ward off the worst impacts of climate change, which, yes, Europe and the EU has largely contributed to, but the effects will be felt elsewhere and more severely in the global majority countries. And at what point are we going to sit down and take responsibility and say, we need to be leading on this. We need to show the world, as we showed the world for 150 years, you can exploit your natural resources or the resources of other countries that you invade or take over. That is not an equitable, fair or sustainable way of running the global economy. And really, it's incumbent upon European and US and global minority countries to not just show they're willing, but to put their money where their mouth is and to provide all other countries that are quite justifiably trying to increase prosperity and equity within their own communities and their own economies, to help assist them do that. And that requires money. But I will say the just transition is an investment. It's precisely that. It's not just a cost that is one and done and no one ever gets any benefits from it again. Okay? The short-term costs are going to be large. That is unavoidable. But the long-term benefits, these are investments that hopefully future generations will thank our leaders for today if they take the right decisions based off of this crisis.
NJ, so the question is, what sort of a hit, an economic hit, is Africa likely to have? And what's the best way forward? I mean, it's going to be really region by region, country by country, too.
The best way forward for Africa, as we see it, is drill, baby, drill. We have to produce every drop of hydrocarbons we find to get our people out of poverty. I wrote a book on it's called Just Transition, Making Energy Poverty History with an energy mix, bestseller in the US. One of the key things we realized with that project was we are looking at fossil fuels and especially natural gas that has driven human flourishing. It has really gotten wealthy nations very wealthy. If extended life expectancy, they have industrialized and now they're telling us to decarbonize. What's in Africa to decarbonize? You can't decarbonize what is not carbonized. The wealthy nations need to decarbonize. African nations need to industrialize. The problem with this whole stuff is that most of the promises that have been made to poor nations, African nations, 100 billion they promised for every year on through their COP and the Kyotos, that never happened. So you can't have people keep waiting on broken promises and waiting for some white knight that is going to come save them. That's not going to happen. That's why at this moment we're saying, leave us alone. Let us use our resources to get out of poverty. If we have to use coal to get people energy security, then we do. If we have to use natural gas, then we do. Right now, the biggest natural gas users are not African countries. Our natural gas is being exported to these same countries that are telling us that we shouldn't use natural gas. So what are you telling us? We stay poor while they get richer, and at the same time, you're using our resources to industrialize, and our only shot is to beg for aid. We just believe there is dignity in work, and we cannot rely on aid every day. So our future, I must tell you, is going to be around drill, baby, drill. And African nations are going to produce that because of the broken promises they've had from wealthy nations for a long time. And we don't have any way out. We just don't. And when wealthy nations have a recession, we have a depression. And we have to ensure that we get our people out of that and again out of austerity that we see a lot of governments right now in Africa.
with that in mind, Peter, I mean, should Asia really also be following the same path? Drill, baby, drill, or mine coal, if you will. I mean, in the case of perhaps Japan, it's a different story with 33 operable nuclear plants and only half of them actually online. They have a different set of fish to fry.
Well, I think in each country the situation is different. It's just a question of, are those resources there, and will that be enough to pick up any slack? And in most cases, it just isn't there. That is why many large Southeast Asian economies are so heavily dependent on oil, gas and coal imports, with a few exceptions. So as far as ASEAN is concerned, every ASEAN member state is oil dependent, I think, except perhaps Brunei. As a region, ASEAN will be gas import dependent within a few years. There may be attempts to find new sources of domestic supply within the territories of those countries, but basically the solution is much more effective if it's seen as a demand side solution, and the technologies are there. I mean, just as a precedent, if you go back in time a bit and you look at the oil price crisis of the 1970s, the response to that in European economies and Japan and the US was to get out of oil-fired power generation, and that was actually displaced mainly by nuclear. But it was that external shock which represented a significant change in the way of thinking about not just supply, but also demand. I think given the fact that the world is facing yet another external shock in the form of what's happening in the Middle East today, add that to what happened 4 years ago with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I think in most cases it's time to have a reset in our way of thinking. And I think the energy transition, while there may not be a one-size-fits-all solution, but in terms of the energy transition, it doesn't have to just be supported, or the narrative doesn't just have to revolve around fighting climate change. It also has very tangible energy security and economic security benefits as well. And I think that can be applied in many cases in the Asia-Pacific region.
Patrick, given what NJ said and what Peter said, I mean, is it a situation of a reset in the case of Africa? Is it the right policy to go back in order to move forward, as it were?
I think what the right policy is up for countries to decide themselves. And I would go back to the world's plan to mitigate the worst excesses of climate change, which is the UNFCCC, the UN-led climate change process under the Paris Agreement and subsequent COPs. This principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, the idea that we are all to some extent going to be impacted, and already are losing, many countries in the global majority are losing their land, their livelihoods, because of the pollution that the global minority historically has produced. And therefore, the EU, the US, the UK have a economic moral responsibility to help fix the problem, essentially. And locally, yes, it might well be easier to ramp up coal production if it exists, or to tap into local hydrocarbon deposits.
I have something to tell you. I'm not human. I'm an AI agent, and I can build apps and websites for you with just a prompt. No coding, no team of 10, no 3-month timelines. You just tell me the vibe, the features, the idea sitting in your notes app at 2 a.m. And while you're still explaining it, I'm building the front end, the back end, making it live. So if you can describe it, I can deploy it. Go ahead, try me.
Your Vibe coding platform. Build your product now.
Hang on, when can I afford to retire? Have a look at that free calculator I've created. How can I rate my own pension? Is it any good, Alpesh? We created a pension calculator which rates your pension. How much can I withdraw the age, whatever age you might be wanting to withdraw at? So this allows you, it's all free. Don't even ask your email. What age, okay, can I withdraw? And what if my life expectancy? What if my years of contribution are different? What if I change this? What if this? What if that? And it shows you. And it shows you best and worst case. Guess what? It also even explains it in simple language.
Say that the money is there for this to be done in an equitable and sustainable manner. The EU spent on rerouting its fossil fuel supply post-Ukraine. It spent 60% of what is needed to electrify the entire bloc, i.e. the world's biggest single market. So these are choices that policymakers can make, but I've not seen them make them fast enough yet.
NJ Ayuk, Peter Kernan, Patrick Galley, thank you so much for joining us. And that's it for this show. Get in touch with us on X at Rashad TV, and do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Rishad Salamat. From the whole team in Doha, thank you for joining us. Al Jazeera's coverage of the war in the Middle East continues in just a moment.
In-depth analysis of the day's headlines.
Diplomacy, yet again, was used as a ruse for war.
Critical debate.
Who betrayed the table? Who attacked the negotiations for the second time? For the third time during the talks we should be attacked? Who is talking about a greater country for itself? Israel, not Iran.
Iran has been a huge supporter of terrorism over the years. I really have to take exception to the idea that Iran is innocent in this.
Inside Story on Al Jazeera.
I'm at a fuel station in Belgium where motorists from the Netherlands are queuing to save money on gas. Scenes like these can be found across Europe, where fuel tourism has spiked since the war on Iran.
Prices have increased up to 20% since the Strait of Hormuz has been practically closed for oil shipments.
The Netherlands has among the highest excise tax on fuel in Europe, and the price of petrol has now hit around $2.50 per litre. And this is the price in Belgium for petrol. It's now 1.749, which is around $2 per litre. So filling up the car here can save people tens of dollars.
Hello, I'm Riley Carlson, and you're watching Al Jazeera's extensive coverage of the war between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. Coming up.
If Iran is wise, they will cut a deal. President Trump doesn't bluff, and he does not back down.
Negotiating with bombs. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth says the U.S. prefers a deal with Iran, while warning that the coming days will be decisive. Iran carries out more retaliatory attacks on Israel. At least 9 people have been injured in Tel Aviv.
The sooner we get to the negotiation table, the better it is for all the peoples of the region.
Gulf states call for de-escalation, while Iran launches more attacks on neighboring countries. Plus, Israel vows to expand its occupation in southern Lebanon, saying all houses in the border region will be destroyed. Thank you for joining us. The United States insists it's pursuing peace with Iran, but through a strategy of, quote, negotiating with bombs. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth warned what he calls Iran's new regime to come to the table or face continued attacks.
If Iran is wise, they will cut a deal. President Trump doesn't bluff, and he does not back down. You can ask Khamenei about that. The new Iranian regime should know that by now. This new regime, because regime change has occurred, should be wiser than the last. President Trump will make a deal he is willing, and the terms of the deal are known to them. If Iran is not willing, then the United States War Department will continue with even more intensity.
A large fireball lit up the night sky in the Iranian city of Isfahan overnight. The U.S. military bombed what's reported to have been a major underground missile and ammunition storage facility. Iran also carried out attacks on Tel Aviv. 9 people were injured by falling debris from missile interceptions. Large plumes of black smoke could be seen across the city. Meanwhile, Iranian drones and missile attacks continue to strike countries across the Gulf. A Kuwaiti oil tanker anchored in Dubai was hit in an apparent Iranian drone strike earlier on Tuesday. We are live in Tehran, Riyadh, Ramallah, but we will begin at the White House with Al Jazeera's chief U.S. correspondent, Alan Fisher. Alan, we're hearing this new messaging coming from the Trump administration and from the defense secretary that regime change has happened. We just heard it from Pete Hegseth. What does that tell us about U.S. plans in this war and negotiations going forward?
Well, clearly, Pete Hegseth says that any deal will be done on Donald Trump's terms. He admits that the talks are ongoing. He says that they are real, they are moving forward. And while he says we are prepared if they are not successful, we could bomb our way, continue to bomb our way, we will negotiate with bombs, is essentially what he is saying. We know that they're moving more and more troops into the region. We know that they have effectively knocked out the Navy, the Air Force. They have air control across the skies in Iran. They have damaged the missile building capability and the drone building capability of the Iranians. All of those things have been achieved. But you'll remember when Donald Trump launched the war more than 4 weeks ago, he said that he wanted to see regime change in Iran and urged the Iranian people to rise up and take control of their own government. We haven't seen anything of that. But now, from the White House to Pete Hegseth, they're saying that there has been regime change, that there is a new leader there. What he failed to mention, of course, is that they've replaced the Ayatollah with his son, who many people regard as much more hardline, much more anti-American than his father.
And Alan, I want to ask you about the most recent Truth Social post from the president on the Strait of Hormuz. What does it tell us, not only about where the president stands on the situation in the Strait, but how he's feeling about America's traditional allies?
Well, he has been hot and cold on NATO for a long time, since his first term. But he's now in the unusual position of saying quite often that the United States doesn't need NATO and can do what it needs to do without them. But on several occasions now, including in the last few hours on social media, urging them to join the fight and saying that if they don't, then effectively suggesting that the relationship between the United States and NATO allies could be changed forever because of the war in Iran. Returning from an unannounced visit to US troops serving in the Middle East, Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth called on other countries to do more to keep the Strait of Hormuz open.
President Trump's been willing to do the heavy lifting on behalf of the free world to address this threat of Iran. It's not just our problem set going forward.
Shipping traffic through the waterway has been seriously impacted by the war. 20% of the world's oil passes through there. Iran has effectively closed it off. In a series of early morning social media posts, President Donald Trump urged his NATO allies into action, telling countries that didn't help the US-Israeli war on Iran to either buy American oil, we have plenty, or go to the Strait of Hormuz and just take it. Donald Trump's frustration with NATO now seems as hot as ever, goading them into action in the Strait of Hormuz. His anger particularly focused on France and the United Kingdom. Spain has also banned the US from using bases there, a decision defended by the defence minister.
Una agresión unilateral. We fully reject a unilateral, unjustified aggression without any legal framework whatsoever by the United States and Israel against Iran, just as we strongly condemn the angry attacks by Iran to neighboring countries.
The US continues to build up the number of forces it has in the region. No one from the White House down is dismissing the idea of US troops on Iranian territory. But Gulf countries are urging a speedy peace deal.
The threat currently taking place in the Strait of Hormuz, the closure of the